Most people understand the principles of effective communication in theory, but what's harder is to catch that in the moment, in practice. In this video, I share 3 activities that help bring communication to life so that people have time to stop, think, review, reflect. What does make effective communication and what does it look like in action? Hi, I'm Kerry Price. I'm the founder of the Facilitators Network, and I use the principles of deliberate generosity to make sure that no meeting or workshop is ever wasted. I've been leading workshops for 20 odd years, and in that time I've led thousands of groups through complex conversations. Now I spend most of my time helping other trainers and facilitators do that well. If you want learning to stick, you need to show, not tell. And communication training is no different. In this video, I'll show you 3 activities that give people a chance to experience effective communication, or not, and see what bubbles up for them. Activity 1, blind snowflake. Now this activity has been around for a really long time, and it's stuck around because it's so good. It never fails to bubble up all sorts of insights about communication. So step 1 is to make sure that every person in the room has a blank piece of paper. Then I invite them to stand up and I let them know I'm going to give them some instructions. Their only job is to listen to my instructions and do as I say. There's a few rules to the game, which is 1, they need to close their eyes so they can't see what anybody else in the room is doing. And 2, they're not allowed to ask me any questions. They just have to follow the instructions in whatever way they interpret them. Step 2 is to set the game in motion. So people are up, they've got their eyes closed, they're holding their piece of paper in front of them, and I simply ask them to fold their piece of paper in half. I keep a scan of the room to see how people are going. Once everyone's folded the piece of paper in half, I invite them to fold it in half again. After the second fold, I invite them to tear off the bottom left-hand corner of the page. Now this is where it gets a little bit interesting. Some people simply tear off a corner. Some people interpret that as left-hand corner of the page, so they open the page to tear it off. This is where things start to go awry. So we've folded the piece of paper in half, we've folded it in half again. I've invited them to tear off the bottom left-hand corner of the page. Once everyone has torn off a corner, I then invite them to keep their eyes closed but open up the page. There's a few gasps from people who have already opened the page, but they pick up where we're going along. The next instruction is to fold the piece of paper in 3. No specific instruction, just in 3. This shows up in all sorts of different ways, and once it's folded into 3, I invite them to tear a hole in the bottom center of the page. You end up with a little bit of confetti on the floor, but that's okay. Once everyone has torn a hole, I invite them to open their page and open their eyes. The next part of the activity is where the fun begins. I now invite them to find someone else in the room who has exactly the same snowflake as them. Now, depending on the size of the group, you might get 1 or 2 people who find a page that is similar. It's never exactly the same, but a similar pattern. But for the most part, everyone in the room has something different. To wrap this up and to bring it into a conversation about communication, I simply say, isn't it interesting? I gave you all exactly the same set of instructions, but you've all ended up with a slightly different version of a snowflake. Why do you think that was? Now, to begin with, people, the first 3 or 4 comments back are something about lack of detail in the directions. And that's true. That's something that's useful in effective communication. But there's actually more to it to that. So I invite them to think a little bit deeper and say something like, so detailed instructions aside, how else might have I explained this task to give you a better chance of all ending up with the same thing? At that point, different insights bubble up. Things like, if you'd shown me the snowflake to begin with so I knew what I was working towards, or if you'd let us open our eyes so we could check in with what our peers or our colleagues were doing, or most importantly, if you'd allowed us to ask questions. Because communication isn't just a one-way thing. Communication is a 2-part or 3-part or 20-part conversation. So once we've unpacked that, we bring it back to the topic of effective communication at work. How does this activity relate to how we communicate with each other at work? What might we need to keep in mind if we're wanting to make sure that everyone's on the same page? Activity 2. This activity is called the communication toss, and you can use it at any time during a workshop, but I quite like to use it after lunch when people are starting to trickle in at different times, different paces. Some people are in the room while others are still grabbing a last-minute coffee. How it works is as people start coming back into the room, I simply toss the first person a ball, like this. Stress balls, juggle balls, tennis balls, ping pong balls, whatever you've got. Toss the first person a ball and I invite them to toss it back to me. But I do so without talking. It's all body language and gestures. If they start to ask a question or talk back to me, I just motion for them to stay quiet, like this. Then as the second and third person comes in, I use gestures to invite them to start tossing the ball between themselves. More people come in and we start to form a circle. As everyone is back into the room, I then introduce a second ball. So instead of just one ball going around the circle, we've got 2 going in different directions. And then after a few more moments, I'll introduce a third ball. The whole time, nobody is speaking, and if they do start to speak, I'll be motioning them to tell them to shh. What's interesting about this is people in the beginning are quite clumsy. They don't know who they're throwing it to. But after a little while, there becomes a real rhythm. People come up with their own signs, their own body language to signal I'm ready, toss it to me. And everyone starts looking out for each other. Instead of just tossing the ball and hoping someone catches it, people are really mindful about making the process work. After letting this go for 3 or 4 minutes and noticing the changes in rhythm, I'll motion for people to pass the balls back into me, all silently, until I've got all 3 balls back in hand. Then, as I do with every experiential activity, I simply say to the group, what did you notice about that activity? All sorts of things bubble up around communication being not just verbal. All of the stuff that goes into communication that's not about opening our mouths. The other thing that often bubbles up that's really useful is how quickly people will just pick up the ball and continue with the game when they've made a mistake. And this offers a really good chance to talk about what happens when there is miscommunication. How much of a deal do we make about it? How much do we blame other people for what went wrong when we could just pick up the ball, reset, and start again? Activity 3. This activity is called 7 words, and it highlights how the meaning of a sentence can change depending on where you put the emphasis. So to kick this off, I invite people to get into pairs and I have a pre-prepared sentence written out on post-it notes. One sentence I like to use a lot is this one. I enjoy attending spontaneous parties with friends. I pass out the post-it note to one post-it note to each pair, but every pair has the sentence ever so slightly different based on a word I've underlined. For example, one pair will have a post-it note that looks like this. I enjoy attending spontaneous parties with friends. Another one might not have enjoy underlined, they'll have parties underlined. So it's I enjoy attending spontaneous parties with friends. Bunch of different pairs, same sentence, but a different word underlined on each of the different post-it notes. What happens next is I invite the person with the sentence to read it aloud to their partner, putting the emphasis on the underlined word. I enjoy attending spontaneous parties with friends, Or I enjoy attending spontaneous parties with friends. After everyone has a chance to share the sentence with their partner, the partner is then invited to mirror back the underlying meaning to the message. So what does that sentence really mean? What's hidden behind the emphasis? We then get people to popcorn those back into the room, and we recognize that one sentence can mean completely different things depending on where you put your emphasis. This uncovers a whole bunch of different conversations around communication, but I most often link it back to what does this mean for written communication? When we're talking to each other, it's easy to put the emphasis on different words, but when we're writing, texting, emailing, how easy it is for things to be lost in translation because the emphasis is missing. Debriefing these kind of activities is what makes them useful. So just doing the activity for fun is one thing. The debrief is what makes it worthwhile. But debriefing each activity as we go along is one thing. Making time to recap and reflect and review at the end of your session is what brings all of the learning back together. In my next video, how to recap a training session, I give you 3 great activities for reviewing, reflecting, recapping at the end of your training session. The link is in the description below. Go check it out.